one of the historical materials, and I believe it's coming up next, was the use of coral as a masonry unit. So since these houses were built right off the ocean, right off the Arabian Sea, they would actually go out and harvest coral and stack them up and use them as a building material. Obviously, that's not such good practice these days, and with the number of people that are actually living there now, it wouldn't be very wise. So we took the idea of the masonry unit and reinformed it back to the idea of the brick, the sort of normative masonry unit that's used in architecture. And so you're starting to see, you saw the previous slides where the masonry brick was used in ways to generate texture and pattern. And we used the digital tools in order also to help with this. So they could quickly move through this idea of texture and pattern by digitally modeling them. Another feature for the texture and pattern that they picked up from the historical side was the idea of the screening. It's called the mashrabiyya in Arabic. So the sort of geometric Islamic patterning for the screening, as well as the use of texture through materials for screening living areas or upstairs living areas that allowed women to look out but not be seen while they were looking out. And so the students then started taking some of these ideas of texture and also utilizing them through the sequence of perspectives, through the materiality, to design their residence as they move through perspective by perspective. And so again, these are first-year architecture students really starting to deal with how light plays with texture, how light plays with space, how texture affects the outside condition. This is a nighttime rendering. And then also using texture or the brick or the masonry unit as a texture or pattern. Again, I'm going to re-emphasize that these are second-year students and that these are introductory topics. And there could be a lot of questions about many things because it is a project in an Islamic country with a lot of cultural let's say baggage, not used in a negative way, but a lot of cultural ideals or differences. And the problem with having students deal with these, it's not really a problem, is each one of them has a different background. So dealing with the ideas of gender, which I feel are important, the ideas of cultural identity, which I also feel are important, these are just the introductory methods in order to do it. Programmatically, they were asked to also contemporize the program in the living space, which I didn't show through plan, but another paper maybe. But the idea here was just to kind of adopt the ideas of historicism, the critical regionalism, sort of taking the ideas of the existing historic housing and adopting it and evolving it toward a contemporary design means. I believe that's all I have. So. Thank you for letting me kind of interrupt the session and kind of get my time in so I can get back to work, and we all love that part of it. So, that's it.
Do you have any questions?
Dear Professor Haweis, thanks for a great presentation. I have a question. What's your main challenge, or which second-term students in Sharjah University in designing its studio lessons? Can you classify? Because it's my issue again.
Are you asking what the main challenge is?
Yeah. Main challenges for teaching students.
I don't think we have enough time to cover that, but there's a lot of challenges. These students come in with, like I said, having lived in sort of these mini mansions. Most of them have never touched a building material, so they have no idea what tools are, what a hammer is, what any of these things are. Most of them have drivers, maids, a lot of everything that stops them. That's kind of this filter that stops them from the reality of construction. So we have a lot of problems on multiple levels. Just getting them introduced to ideas of thinking for themselves, critically thinking, which most of them come up through a very primary education, so when they come into the school and into a very subjective subject, they have a hard time adjusting. That there is no right answer is what we're always telling them, that it's an exploration, that they have to find their way through it, and it's a very difficult concept for them to understand that. So that, laced with their background of no construction, no architecture, no hands-on use of anything, it's all very difficult, and it all piles up into a huge problem. And I wish I had an answer. They kind of put out fires every semester. I believe teaching, especially here, is a design exercise in of itself. That every semester I look at what was successful and how to move forward, and especially in these conditions, it's extremely challenging. I often say, if I can learn to teach here, I can teach anywhere. I think it's pretty true.
And the question, what's your own solution to solve this problem?
What's that?
What's your own solution?
The solution is time, right? The other problem with teaching architecture is we are expecting more and more of architects every day. Right? They now have to know this huge litany of digital tools on top of building knowledge, on top of philosophy, on top of history, and then essentially we have 4 years of education for them. They graduate with a 5-year Bachelor of Architecture, but our foundations year is given its autonomous program. So we have 4 years to try and teach all of this. So the solution is time and patience, a lot of patience. Just repetitious, always repeating the same things over and over. And eventually it does sink in, usually about the 50th.
I have a question for Alexandra. Could you discuss a bit more about the existing condition of hygiene at the beginning of modernization? Let's say, like how did the majority perceive that kind of a living condition? And because I suppose that they got the original idea or concept of hygiene, which must be different from the modern concept, and how did they actually respond to the campaign of the hygienists or doctors or architects, and how they gradually adopt or receive or
The hygiene, the sanitary house, completed in Greece about 1938, when a big exhibition about hygiene was done there. And that was the first event that the majority of the people came in front of a house and the way of living completely different. In small villages, even in 1950, they didn't used to have a bathroom. The unit of bathroom inside the house, it was completely unknown. Even in 1950, not 1850 that I discussed before, it was a new issue and a new thing that architecture had to think of how to persuade people to live in such a way. Even public baths weren't in use for most of the people. And I think the main impact of medicine is that it made people to think about health before to think about cleanliness. They had to struggle about this diseases, and then to think the role of bath, the role of water, for example. They used to think that water was a threat because it was the path through which the water was the path through which the disease came inside the body. So when the idea of the clean body became became well established for the people. Then they tried to think about the idea of the clean house. It was that was the consequence. First, the medicine established the clean body idea, and then the architects translated that idea in spatial terms, in design terms. And that was the main issue. First the body, and then the relation to space.
Yeah, so the majority gradually adopt the modern concept of hygiene.
They adopted after 1938, when that exhibition was held in Athens, and a lot of people, mainly from the capital, went there and see a model of one-by-one constructed the hygiene house with the bathroom, with the kitchen and the plums, the plumbing, and that was the first time that it was well distributed in the majority. Before, only the very wealth houses had that opportunity. And that's because it was also the problem with the distribution of water. It wasn't, there wasn't, after the marathon, it was, I don't know the name, a big hydraulic construction was made in Marathon, like a lake, for giving in the capital and all the households draining water. Before that, it couldn't be done. It couldn't be done, the hygienic house, because they didn't have water to do so.
Yeah, because for me it's very interesting. I mean, more interesting to look at kind of cultural aspect, because you mentioned that the campaign about hygiene related much about the idea of modernity and kind of the nation building of the modern Greece things, and so I mean so I just wonder that the existing condition at the beginning, was it really unhygienic, or it's just about a different concept? I mean, because the people in the past also, they could live in those kind of conditions for such a long time, but maybe it's also because of the expansion of cities as well, or some like a denser like a community that created the problems later, and then here comes the modernization. So like it's I mean, very interesting to see the process and how majority responded and how it took time. Yeah. Thank you.
Hi. I have a question for the lady from South Africa. Sorry, I couldn't note your name. I wish that were.
My name's
Sorry?
Philippa.
Okay, sorry. It was very interesting, your presentation about ARCHTHEO house. I have lots of questions actually, but I'm going to try to keep you. You were explaining about the geothermal pipes which you are using for the design of this house, and you were talking about that it was very expensive materials. You should do some researches about the cost of this house and what will be the income after the energy efficiency. Do you have any numbers about the percentages? I mean, how long it will take to this house to use the energy itself and to, you know, take the cost back from the construction?
At the moment, no, because the inhabitants are only going to start living there, if I'm correct. We're now in November. They're going to start living in November, so the reason they live there is so we can start to measure these things. But I mean, I do mention it in the paper. The pavilion isn't necessary. I quite blatantly say it's not a sustainable project. It's not sustainable in that its initial cost is very difficult to recover even post-occupancy. What it does do, it's basically a billboard that advertises technological processes. And now that you mention it, the geothermal pipe was probably the cheapest process that we used in that house. I mean, we've got bells and whistles in there that even I had never heard about. I do hear what you're saying, but hopefully with the test that happened, that's going to happen over 4 months, because it's also a public park. You can't have people living there for indefinitely. There's security issues and things like that.
Yeah, the second question will be that one, that how we are going to select person who are going to live there, because it's something like the middle of the nowhere, and of course there will be no person living for their lifetime, but what type of experience will it be? I mean, who are going to get these experiences? I mean, anybody who would like to join, they're going to be live there, or how it will happen?
It was quite incredible working with this project. There's 4 younger people than me who volunteered to live there because they think it's really cool, and 2 of them are ex-students of mine. So they've volunteered to live there for 4 months, and the doors are completely open. There's no partner bars, just an alarm, and it's volunteers basically.
Thank you.
If I may be permitted to monopolize the microphone, I have a question for Philippa, Alexandra, and Mark. Okay, Philippa first. This isn't really a well-formed question, it's more of a thought that came as you were presenting, and I can see the obvious advantages and opportunities of aligning these kind of architectural experiment with all of its timely relevance with advertising and fashion and all of the sexiness and slickness that comes with that. At the same time, I'm wondering, though, about the innate transience of fashion and its fickleness. And so if important technological innovations and new ways of thinking about the sort of carbon footprint and things like that of what we build is too strongly married to fashion, does it ultimately set itself up for its own demise? Or is it a passing trend and then, next season we're onto something else? So that was, can we maximize, can we ride the wave in the short term, but in the long term, it doesn't generate a long-standing or a more tenacious, what's the word I'm looking for? I can't think of it. A longer lifespan, let's say.
That's an interesting question. We're dealing with sort of the ideas behind this. I think you're talking more about trends. Again, I use pedestrian terms. But what we're trying to deal with here through advertisement, which is something that has come into fashion quite lately, is instead of thinking of fashion as just a series of trends or trends that follow on each other, rather look towards the social, cultural impact of fashion. Ultimately, we all fashion ourselves to do something. We don't fashion ourselves according to a trend. We either reject it, admire it, ridicule it, or follow it. But the idea is the inclination formed, or the inclination that is stirred by by a considered imagination, that fashion, in the broader concept of it, sort of inspires within us. So, and if you look at trends, that's something else I like to look into, and I'm not very good at. But this project wasn't done based on trends, which is why the shape of the pavilion, the location of it, and what it does is actually just about the advertisement through an image that one hopes will inspire some level of consideration and imagination and perspective and identification, starts to advertise something, which is what fashion does. So it's not necessarily about trends. I mean, the fashion designer that when I grow up I want to be just like is Hussein Shahia, and if you look at the stuff that he was doing, say, 10, 12 years ago, it's still incredibly relevant today. So even though that trend, as one could put it, is coming to an end, the concepts and the ideas that he was dealing with are still relevant. So it's not the trend, it's the idea or social cultural phenomena of it that I'd like to look at. Does that answer your question?
Yes, it does. Thank you. Okay, Alexandra, as you were speaking, and in response to Chun-Chun's question as well, when you talked about the infrastructural works of the water reservoir at Marathon, throughout your presentation, and when you're talking about how architecture slowly, the buildings slowly incorporated these kinds of hygienic improvements, my thought was, are all of these homes built by architects? Like, or is a lot of the domestic space, certainly in non-urban areas, but even in an urban center like Athens, really always built, like designed and built by trained architects? I know nothing about the professionalization of architecture in this context. So I guess I'm interested. Certainly an exhibition in 1938 would have appealed to the educated communities more so. Did Mr. and Mrs. Everyman have the same kind of access, and could they have incorporated these kinds of changes into their constructed environments without the help of professionals? Like, itali mastori I architectons.
No, most of the houses were built without architects, with engineers, most of them by engineers. But the impact of architects were very considerable, because they write it in the Athenian press of the time, trying to persuade the society about the importance of improving the legislation about hygiene and the infrastructure, the public infrastructure that would support the construct of the sanitary dwellings. It was a matter of public hygiene. It was an urgent necessity for everybody, for the well-being of the society. So it wasn't so much a matter of architecture. I think that's why I didn't show any pictures about forms, architectural forms or plans, because it was a discussion about before the forum. It was a pro-modernization state.
Thank you. Okay, and lastly, Mark. I find it very interesting, this whole idea of the woman having the opportunity to, at long last, to project herself onto the interior. And I'm just wondering, were there zones of the house that were particularly suited to that, or was the entire interior realm of the home the woman's canvas? Or is it for this kind of self-expression and, as you said, when you were talking about Gordon's work, that the bourgeois interior was the place where the woman could really project herself. Is that everywhere in the house, or specific spaces?
I think it's actually more complex than that. One of the things that I alluded to was the idea of the separate spheres, and what you often find is the identification of the home with domesticity and with sort of privacy. But what we also find in the literature, if you look through the 19th century, is that a number of people, particularly Mary House, did this. She would have public events in her home. So she would invite quite eminent speakers and politicians, people like archaeologists, religious leaders, scientists, to come and give lectures within her home. So what we might ostensibly call a feminine domestic aesthetic of somewhere like the drawing room, at moments becomes a bit like a salon. It becomes a public venue. And so the notion is that the home is this sort of subversive place of women's entrapment, which has been argued, is actually not necessarily true. That there are places where these homes, although they display the domestic sort of aesthetic of sort of women's literary culture, women's culture, are also public venues. So I think we have to be really careful with this kind of work, that there were big statements made quite rightly, you know, in the sort of 70s, in the 80s and 90s, which are now being questioned by much more close scrutiny of this kind of literature. And I know that people have been looking at things like Edith Wharton's writing, and you know, she wrote The Decoration of Houses, the American kind of author, and the transference of her ideas onto her own home. And what she did, instead of feminizing more of the home, she sort of demasculinized part of the home. Now that, again, I'm really hesitant to use these words because people say, what does that mean? And you get students who suddenly say, well, masculine things is making stuff out of wood and, you know, and women's stuff is doing tapestry or something. So you've got to be careful about these sort of stratifications. I don't know if that answers it, but you asked 3 questions. Can I answer with 3 as well? I just want to point out something, because you said something to Philippa, where you said something about the fickleness of fashion. And I get angry when I hear things like that, not necessarily, but just in a little way, because I think that sometimes we make this assumption that fashion is sort of fickle, transient, and something to be dismissed. And I noticed that in all the work I do, I don't talk about fashion, I talk about Haweis' attitude to dress, so it's a different kind of thing. But also, if you look at the French philosopher Gilles Lipovetsky in his book called Empire of Fashion, Lipovetsky talks quite clearly that fashion is the ultimate condition of modernity. It is the sign of modernism because it continually rejects the past. And therefore fashion is, although we think it's tradition, it is the ultimate condition because it continually rejects tradition, it rejects the past, it reinvents itself all the time. And if a condition of modernity is the reinvention of ourselves, then fashion is that ultimate symbol. And therefore it is really, really important, despite the fact we might hate it. You know, it's kind of there. It's what we have to deal with. Sorry, was I preaching? It sounded a bit like that. I was just going to say the third thing about hygiene. I think it's a really interesting subject, because in the work I was doing, reading lots of what we might call family literary magazines from the 19th century, you find that there were a lot of these sort of women's magazines that were concerned with health in the home, hygiene, ventilation, how to get good sanitary things in the home and things. So these are issues I think that are really important. You can see how they travel across culture. I think that's great. It's good to see that.
Sally Stone from the Manchester School of Architecture. 4 very interesting presentations, I think, and despite the diversity, there are many links. But my comments really are aimed at Mark, because I think Mary Howeis was living and writing at a time when the position of women in society was a pivotal point. It was actually changing. Women were being heard. They had a valid opinion, although within a very, very narrow spectrum. But it had become acceptable for women to speak, to have an opinion, and for their opinion to be noticed. And it's quite interesting that what she was saying is actually very relevant to the second decade of the 21st century, in that the personality of someone can be projected directly into their interior, into their home, or directly projected from that, so that it's that sense that we are sold a way of living completely. We buy into a way of living, which is a projection of our personality.
I think that's probably quite true, but I also think there's this sort of thing going on in culture at the moment. Certainly in Australia, I see it a little bit in the UK, where there's this culture of depersonalising space as well because of marketability, and you see it coming through retail and things like that. Where I've seen a couple of studies where they've reported on the way that if you neutralise and depersonalise a home, you can sell it quicker than if you leave. I was told if I wanted to sell my house, I have to get rid of all my books because it identified a type of, I don't know, intellectual with the home, and therefore people who weren't like that wouldn't be able to identify with space. So the retailers are continually asking you to kind of evacuate your personality in order to market it. And that's a really strange and quite difficult thing. The other thing, the first part of your question was really about sort of women's histories and the exposure, I think, of women writers from the 19th century. One of the great tragedies, I think, is in the advent of modernism, there was arguments being put forward that were coming from a particular kind of elite and a particular position on design. And many of these women got eclipsed. They got kind of lost in that kind of world, I think that's...
I just have one further comment. So, I guess for you, Mark, it was based on this idea that the piece of furniture is just an extension of the clothing, which is an extension of the body. And it's very interesting that Barbara Cartland, that famous writer, she said that when a woman reaches 40, she has to make the decision of whether for the rest of her life she chooses to stand up or sit down.
I shall leave it on that one.
Okay, I have a question for Philippa. I think the whole idea of advertising was really interesting. But to me, it seems like we're out of the question, because we're talking about sustainability, and then the question is an isolated pavilion really sustainable in South Africa? Because it's advertising techniques, solar panels, isolation, which I think are marvelous, of course, but it's still talking about an image of a pavilion with maybe people having 2 cars, with roads and stuff like that. So is that really sustainable? Or is it some kind of greenwashing?
The things in my paper, and I should have started with, I always say this house is not sustainable. It doesn't employ any single principle of sustainability. What it does do, which is an area that interests me, is that it deals with efficiency. So in the absence or in the vagueness or in the elusiveness of sustainability, which I think most of the world and most disciplines are dealing with, efficiency becomes, in my very poorly researched opinion, the best option. So it deals with efficiency. How do you efficiently take what you've got and utilize it to the best possible extent? And the idea got born out of the studies, my doctoral study, which deals with utilization. So we need to increase on the level of utilization that we've got. At the moment, right now, we're sort of exploiting at the rate of a Ferrari and utilizing at the rate of a Beetle, so a 1974 Beetle. If we utilize a lot, if we utilize 100%, we are going to start to address sustainability. So no, the pavilion is not sustainable at all.
I have another question from Professor ARCHTHEO. I think some mysteries are behind our beauty and shaping dress. So what's your opening idea about myth of beauty and installation with dress or fashion?
Sorry, the relationship
between myth and shaping dress. Myth between dress, fashion.
Yeah.
Yeah.
The relationship between dress, fashion, and, or just dress and fashion.
Okay. Forming the dress. Yeah. Maybe some myths behind the dress and shaping beauty. What's your proposal? An idea.
From the work that I was looking at, Mary Haweis in her writing was quite clear that she was talking about dress as a sort of a form of expression of the body that could be done in various ways. I mean, she looked back at Greek dress, and I mean, she made some quite provocative statements. She talked about how, in her reading, the very early Greek dress was a very, very thin dress that clung to the body, and talks about it in a very sexual way. Sort of talks about this thinness and almost transparency, and talks about being proud of our naked bodies. Now, this is somebody in Victorian times who we certainly normally understood as being this world of, you know, inhibition and, you know, and protection, you know, and covering up. And here she is writing about the freedom of a thin kind of dress and the presentation of the naked body. So, in that sense, I think she's talking about dress as this kind of either cultural or societal way of projecting ourselves out and moving through. Whereas she, at the time, she was talking about fashion. When she critiqued fashion, her critique of fashion, which was coming from Paris at the time, was a fashion that was used to distort the body. So things like using large steel cages to push dresses out, you know, that crinoline stuff, or they had big bustles to give them a big backside, you know, to kind of, so in that sense she critiqued that as fashion because it was changing the shape of the body. Yeah. So that was...
Hello. I think I have sort of maybe a question for Mark. I still haven't made up my mind who the question is at the end.
We haven't made up our mind who's going to answer.
Maybe it does offer some sort of a more anecdotal observation of the struggle Sabine and myself had for the last three days in Istanbul. So in a way it touches with something Philippa starts, and it definitely touches Alexandra, and then maybe the question goes to Mark. And the thought was our check-in at our hotel in Istanbul about 4 days ago. But suddenly when we booked into a nice hotel here, we were faced with this thing in the bedroom, which which the hotel manager said that's their concept, which was a massive shower next to the bed, which they installed. Which is quite interesting, because again, in a funny way, it is touching on something Philippa started, which is all about some sort of fashionable hotels and fashionable concepts, and suddenly starting with that bathroom, which is something Alexandra started, completely invades the bedroom to the point that you wake up and your face is up a glass wall, because there is no space for a table next to that, which is completely bizarre. And we were struggling for like 2 or 3 days with that. And then we met a friend of ours here in Istanbul, Dinçer, who's an architect, practicing architect. And somehow the discussion got to that, and he said that is his main problem in Istanbul, because everybody wants it now, suddenly. So everybody thinks that's the most fashionable, that's the most beautiful thing you can have, up to the point that flats he's working on at the moment are completely unworkable for living in. And the clients actually ring him like 3 months after they're finished, and he's advised them apparently that it's not working, but they still insist on even having the toilet open, and having the shower open, and having the bedroom open. And then in the end they sort of realize, after the whole building process is finished, that all the things they've seen, all these things they think are beautiful, sort of don't work anymore. They really don't work anymore. Unfortunately they have to live with them.